Imagine someone sitting in silence at the end of the day, the lights dim, the noise of the world slowly fading away, and inside their mind a soft, steady, almost imperceptible voice begins to be heard, that inner voice that never stops, that comments, interprets, anticipates, remembers, judges, and builds, because there, in that intimate dialogue, the future reality is being born without most people ever noticing it. Neville Goddard taught that the firm conviction that something is true eventually makes it true, not by force, not through external struggle, but through an inner persuasion so deep that the mind stops arguing with it. Ancient poets already sensed this. Centuries of imagination have moved invisible mountains, yet few are able to sustain a firm conviction when there is no external proof. True persuasion is not the repetition of empty words. It is an act of intense attention. It is learning to listen inwardly, as if you were already hearing what you desire to experience outwardly, because everything you want to hear in the world must first be heard within you. When you embrace the outside inside yourself and become someone who only listens to what implies the fulfillment of their desire, external events begin to organize themselves like a natural bridge toward its manifestation. Your inner dialogue is constantly being written around you in the form of events, encounters, decisions, and opportunities. And when you learn to relate those events to what you have been affirming internally, you become aware of your own creative process. That inner dialogue is the mental conversations you maintain with yourself, sometimes clear when you are in silence, other times almost invisible beneath the noise of routine, but always active, always influencing, always shaping experience. Whether you perceive it or not, you are its author, and the outer world adapts to its tone, its content, its direction. Heaven is not separate from you. It is within your consciousness, silently revealing what is to come through images, intuitions, and inner states. Sustained inner dialogue from the premise of the wish already fulfilled is the most direct path to creating a life that is coherent, intelligible, and aligned. Observing what you tell yourself is observing the cause of your future actions, because that dialogue reveals from which state of consciousness you are looking at the world. When you align that dialogue with what you wish to experience, events inevitably begin to reflect it. One sustained inner word can direct an entire life, just as a small rudder guides a great ship. The manifested world is nothing more than the solidified echo of the inner word, of repeated thought, of sustained feeling. When you observe without judgment what you say to yourself, you discover the ideas from which you are creating your reality. Imagination reflects the state with which it is fused, and that state is the true cause of everything that appears in your life. That is why you do not need to obsessively ask what to do, but rather decide who you are being internally, because when you identify with a new state, your inner dialogue changes, and with it, the entire direction of your experience. Today's inner conversations are tomorrow's events. Renewing the mind means abandoning the old automatic dialogue and consciously building a new one aligned with your purpose. Just as the body responds to the food it receives, the mind responds to the ideas it consumes. Stop the mechanical, negative, repetitive dialogue and begin a new one that arises from the premise that your desire is already a living reality within you. Build phrases that imply achievement, stability, coherence, contribution, and repeat them not as an empty ritual, but as a way of educating your inner identity. Inner dialogue represents the world you inhabit. Everything you plant within, you harvest without. Life does not respond to what you occasionally desire, but to what you hold as normal within yourself. The art of living consists in maintaining the feeling of the wish fulfilled and allowing circumstances to come to you instead of chasing them from lack. Observe what you tell yourself when no one is listening, because that is where your results are being formed. When your inner dialogue matches what you would say if you had already reached your goal, your energy aligns, your decisions organize themselves, your perceptions refine, and reality begins to respond. The conditions of your life are crystallized inner sound, thought turned into experience, word transformed into form. Pay attention right now to what ideas you are accepting as true within yourself, because they are silently being woven into the stage of your life. Changing your life is not changing the outer world, it is changing the inner dialogue that sustains your identity. When imagination aligns your dialogue with the fulfilled desire, a direct channel opens between the inner and the outer, and you begin to recognize that reality is a continuous conversation between your mind and your experience. Every human advancement is born from the conscious use of imagination, from persistence in a stable inner assumption. When you learn to govern your inner dialogue from the premise of the accomplished result, processes simplify, action becomes natural, and clarity replaces effort. Happiness arises when you voluntarily use your imagination to affirm internally that you already are what you desire to be, frequently occupying that feeling until it becomes your natural identity. The more you inhabit that state, the more real it becomes for your inner system, and the more fluid its external expression becomes. None of this is magic. It is sustained coherence. If this message is resonating with you and you want to continue going deeper into content that expands consciousness and strengthens inner clarity, do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow each new video and keep growing together on this path of conscious transformation. Imagine someone walking down the street convinced that life happens to them without control, looking at circumstances as if they were an external force deciding for them, believing they are a victim of destiny, when in reality, most of the time, human beings are completely unaware of their own inner dialogue and therefore do not recognize themselves as the silent cause of what they experience. To consciously create a circumstance, it is not enough to desire it. It is necessary to deliberately direct that inner dialogue, to make that small inner voice coincide with the state of what has already been accomplished. Because the true creator does not wait for external signs, but calls the things that are not yet seen as if they already existed. Correct inner dialogue is not a minor detail. It is one of the deepest arts that exist. It is the exit door from limitation into freedom, and ignorance of this law has turned the world into a battlefield where people believe everything must be achieved through strain, effort, and sacrifice, when in truth life could be a space of discovery, coherence, and expansion. The word is an image of the mind, and the mind reflects a greater creative principle. Therefore, what you repeat within yourself is not innocent. It is shaping your experience. There was once a simple yet powerful revelation, an inner voice that said, "Stop spending your thoughts, your time, and your energy. Everything in life must be an investment. To spend is to waste without return. To invest is to place attention and energy into something that will inevitably bear fruit." And here lies the central point. What you desire is not in the future. It is available right now within you. At every instant you stand before an invisible choice, to spend your thoughts on fear, complaint, comparison, insecurity, or to invest them in the feeling of being what you desire to be. Only the now truly exists. The present does not go into the past. It moves toward the future to meet you transformed into result. Thought is the true currency of heaven. Money is only its visible symbol. Each moment can be an investment or a silent loss, and your inner dialogue reveals exactly what you are doing with your life. When you feel misunderstood, ignored, mistrustful, or afraid, you are spending your energy. When you internally assume the feeling of wholeness, clarity, stability, or confidence, you are investing. You cannot abandon the present to a negative dialogue and expect to direct your destiny with coherence. The circumstances you see before you are softened expressions of past inner conversations, word turned into form, mind and word functioning as a single force. Therefore, responsibility is not outside. It lies in what you choose to nourish within. If you want to shape a more harmonious world, begin by caring for what you think, what you affirm internally, what you consent to as true. The human mind is like a creative mouth. Feed only thoughts that elevate, organize, and stabilize your identity. The present is always the right moment to plant a new inner word, to choose life, coherence, clarity, direction. What you choose internally recognizes only what is similar to it, and that is why your dialogue must bless, expand, and open possibilities. Many people believe they do not know what to do because their dialogue seems empty or confused, but the inner dialogue never remains without form. It always seeks to objectify itself. It always ends up materializing. When you align your inner word with the desire already fulfilled, your perception of the world changes. Your decisions become organized. Your reactions soften, and the environment begins to reorganize itself. When there is conflict between the inner dialogue and the desire, the dialogue always wins because it is the living expression of what you are truly holding. The inner tongue ignites or extinguishes the course of your life. That is why honestly observe what you are telling yourself right now, what you are validating as truth, because that is being silently woven into your future experience. If this message is helping you see your life more clearly, leave in the comments a phrase that represents the inner state you choose to inhabit from today onward, because writing it strengthens your commitment and creates a collective energy that supports the process. If you wish to support this space so we can continue sharing deep and valuable content, you can do so through Super Chat as a gesture of conscious collaboration. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that these reflections, practices, and teachings can continue to accompany you consistently on your path of growth, focus, and inner transformation. And from there, something almost imperceptible yet profoundly transformative begins. A silent re-education of the mind. A relearning of the way you speak to yourself when no one is listening, when there are no external witnesses, when identity becomes naked and reveals its true beliefs because there, in that intimate territory, the direction of your experience is truly decided. It is not in the great public moments, it is not in the speeches you give outwardly. It is in those invisible seconds when an idea crosses your mind and you decide whether to accept it or correct it, whether to feed it or let it pass. Every sustained thought is a seed. Every indulged emotion is a direction. Every repeated inner image is an instruction that consciousness executes with absolute fidelity. Human beings usually think that facts come first and interpretations come afterward, but in reality it happens the other way around. First, an inner narrative is installed, then the world organizes circumstances to confirm it. That is why so many people repeat the same patterns for years without understanding why. Not because life is unfair or limited, but because the inner dialogue keeps reproducing the same script, the same assumptions, the same anticipated conclusions. Changing the dialogue is not a superficial act. It is a true reprogramming of identity. It is learning to deliberately occupy a new state of consciousness until it becomes natural, familiar, automatic. At first, it may feel artificial, as if you were speaking a language you do not yet master, but with conscious repetition, the mind begins to accept it as a new normal. And when something becomes normal for your internal system, it stops generating resistance, it stops producing emotional contradiction, it stops activating constant doubts. Stability is born when thought, emotion, and inner imagery begin to vibrate in coherence. It is not about denying external reality, but about stopping using it as the primary reference to define who you are. The true reference must be internal, because from there, all experience originates. When you choose to inhabit the feeling of the fulfilled result, you are not waiting for something to happen. You are training your nervous system, your perception, and your identity to operate from a new logic. You begin to make different decisions, to interpret events with more neutrality, to respond instead of react, to perceive opportunities where you once only saw obstacles. Life does not change by chance. It changes because you change the point from which you look at it. The correct inner dialogue does not seek to convince the world. It seeks to convince your own internal system of a new truth. When that happens, the environment simply aligns. The present is always the only real laboratory where this work can be done. You cannot transform yesterday, you cannot inhabit tomorrow, you can only plant now. Each instant is an opportunity for conscious investment, a chance to choose what kind of mind you are building, what kind of identity you are consolidating. If you abandon the present to autopilot, the past will keep repeating itself. If you take the present with intention, the future begins to silently reorganize itself. Most people live spending their mental energy on worries, comparisons, judgments, anticipated fears, narratives of scarcity, stories of insufficiency. That is not neutral. That is a constant drain of creative power. To invest means placing attention on what strengthens, organizes, stabilizes, and expands. It means choosing thoughts that imply solution, growth, coherence, progressive trust. It is not naive optimism. It is conscious direction. When you choose what to feed within, you are choosing what kind of world you will allow to manifest outside. The mind is a fertile field. It does not question the seed, it simply develops it. That is why it is not enough to desire something occasionally. It is necessary to sustain it as identity, to turn it into habitual dialogue, to allow it to filter into the way you think, speak to yourself, and interpret what happens. Habit creates reality. Repetition creates stability. Persistence creates evidence. When the inner dialogue matures in silence, one day it emerges as a fact, as an opportunity, as a meeting, as an unexpected change. To the superficial mind, it looks like luck. But to the one who observes their inner world, it is simply accumulated coherence. Nothing appears out of nothing. Everything has an invisible gestation. Every external achievement was first a sustained inner conversation. Every liberation was first a silent decision. Every transformation was first a change of identity. When you understand this, you stop fighting circumstances and begin to educate the cause. Control is not in manipulating the environment, it is in governing the inner narrative. Freedom is not in escaping the world, it is in learning to generate from within a broader, more stable, more conscious state. And as that state consolidates, life responds naturally, not with effort, not with tension, but as a logical consequence of a new inner order that has finally found coherence. And the longer you remain in that new inner order, the more evident something very subtle becomes. You no longer need to push yourself to act. The right actions emerge almost by themselves, without friction, without mental exhaustion, without that heavy inner dialogue that used to argue every step. The body begins to move with a different calm. Decisions lose their drama. Relationships reorganize. Problems are perceived as information and not as threats. It is not that challenges disappear. It is that your identity is no longer defined by them. The mind stops anticipating catastrophes and begins to interpret signals, opportunities, learnings. This is an inner maturity that cannot be bought, inherited, or imposed. It is cultivated in silence, phrase by phrase, thought by thought, choice by choice. The real work happens when no one is watching, when only you know which version of yourself you are feeding. Many people believe that change requires great events, heroic decisions, dramatic breaks, when in reality deep change almost always begins as a delicate adjustment in the inner dialogue, as a new way of interpreting an everyday situation, as a slightly more conscious reaction to something that used to trigger an automatic response. That small shift, repeated consistently, becomes a new trajectory. Identity does not change through public declarations. It changes through sustained private conversations. When you begin to speak to yourself as someone who trusts, your nervous system learns to relax. When you speak to yourself as someone who respects themselves, your boundaries become ordered. When you speak to yourself as someone who progresses, your perception begins to detect paths where there were once only walls. The mind is a system of coherence. It always seeks to confirm the story it is telling. If the inner story is expansion, attention will seek expansion. If it is lack, attention will seek lack. That is why there is no neutrality in the inner dialogue. Every thought carries an implicit direction. Training does not consist of obsessively policing every inner word, but of developing a growing sensitivity to the general tone that governs your mind. Over time, you begin to recognize when you are investing and when you are spending your mental energy. There are thoughts that strengthen and thoughts that erode, even if in the short term they seem logical or justifiable. Inner maturity consists in choosing coherence over reaction. This does not mean repressing emotions. It means not building identity from them. An emotion is a signal, not a sentence. A thought is a proposal, not an order. When you learn to observe without fusing with them, you gain freedom, clarity, and a quiet authority over your own inner world that gradually reshapes everything you experience from the inside out. Freedom. And from that freedom, you can consciously choose the state you want to inhabit. Desire is not a whimsical fantasy. It is an evolutionary direction of consciousness, an invitation to expand identity. When desire is understood as an inner calling rather than a lack, it becomes an organizing force. The mind stops chasing and begins to allow. Allowing is not passivity, it is alignment. It is acting from an inner place that already recognizes the result as coherent with its identity. This changes your relationship with time. The future stops being a source of anxiety and becomes a natural continuity of the present. Waiting loses its drama. Patience stops being sacrifice and becomes stability. Progress is measured more by the quality of the inner state than by the speed of external results. And paradoxically, when the state stabilizes, results often accelerate. Not because anything is forced, but because inner resistance is removed. Resistance is not always conscious. It often shows up as chronic doubt, excessive self-pressure, the need for control, constant comparison, fear of making mistakes, the need for external validation. All of these are signs of an inner dialogue still anchored in an old state. It is not defeated by fighting it. It dissolves by building a new one, broader, more trustworthy, more coherent. The old dialogue loses strength when it stops receiving attention. The mind works like a muscle. What you use gets stronger. If you practice the narrative of stability, stability becomes natural. If you practice the narrative of clarity, clarity becomes your reference. If you practice the narrative of growth, growth stops being a goal and becomes an identity. This does not mean that doubts or fluctuations never appear. It means they no longer govern the system. They are observed, integrated, and transcended more quickly. Mature consciousness does not seek to eliminate imperfection. It seeks not to identify with it. Every human being is always in process, but not everyone consciously chooses where they are heading. Inner dialogue is the invisible rudder. When you recognize it, you recover sovereignty. You no longer need to blame the environment, circumstances, people, or the past. You assume a calm responsibility, not as a burden, but as freedom. Responsibility means the ability to respond from awareness, not from automatism. Life then stops feeling like a sequence of random blows and begins to be perceived as a dynamic conversation between your inner state and the world. This understanding does not create arrogance, it creates conscious humility. You realize you are always learning to refine your coherence, to listen more deeply, to adjust with greater subtlety. There is no final point. There is constant deepening. Each level of consciousness opens new layers of sensitivity, new responsibilities, new opportunities for integration. Real transformation is not a goal, it is a way of living. And when this approach becomes natural, the mind no longer lives scattered between past and future, but inhabits the present with a different quality of attention. The now stops being a place of escape and becomes the creative space par excellence. Here you choose who you are. Here you invest your energy. Here you plant your identity. Here you train your dialogue. Here you build the invisible bridge toward the experiences you want to embody. Everything else is a consequence. And at that point, something happens that many people do not expect. The outer world stops feeling like an enemy to be conquered and begins to be perceived as a field of responses, like a dynamic mirror that reflects with surgical precision the inner state you are inhabiting. You no longer interpret every obstacle as a sign of failure or every delay as a punishment, but as information inviting you to refine your inner coherence even more. The mature mind understands that not every immediate result defines the real direction of the process, because visible reality is always one step behind inner reality. When this understanding stabilizes, anxiety drops, urgency dissolves, and a quiet confidence appears that does not need justification. That confidence is not arrogance or illusion. It is the natural consequence of knowing that you are consistently sowing at the right level. Many people give up just before inner coherence finishes consolidating, not because the process does not work, but because they still wait for external validation to authorize themselves to sustain a new state. But the real shift happens when you no longer need permission from the environment to inhabit a broader identity. When your inner dialogue stops depending on what happens outside, it becomes stable. And when it becomes stable, it becomes creative. Creativity does not come from tension. It comes from inner freedom. A relaxed, coherent, focused mind generates solutions, connections, intuitions, and clear decisions without excessive effort. Not because it is more intelligent, but because it is less fragmented. Inner fragmentation is what exhausts, confuses, and disperses. Every time you contradict yourself internally, part of your energy is lost trying to sustain opposing narratives. When you align your dialogue in a single clear direction, that energy integrates and becomes available. This integration translates into greater presence, sharper perception, and a greater capacity to sustain long-term projects without emotional burnout. You stop living in constant peaks and crashes and begin to build progressive stability. That stability does not mean rigidity. It means flexible coherence, the ability to adapt without losing your center. Life remains dynamic, but you no longer become disorganized with every change. You learn to navigate instead of resist. The correct inner dialogue does not try to control every detail of reality. It seeks to sustain an identity clear enough for aligned decisions to emerge naturally. This releases an enormous amount of energy that was previously trapped in doubt, comparison, and negative anticipation. When the mind stops fighting itself, a sense of inner space appears, as if life could breathe more fully inside you. That space is pure creativity. In that space, new perspectives arise, new associations, new possibilities that you could not see before because you were too busy defending old narratives. Deep change does not always show up as a spectacular event. Often it appears as a new, quiet normal. One day you notice you respond differently to a situation that used to overwhelm you. Another day you realize you make a calm decision where fear once dominated. Another day you perceive that your inner dialogue no longer sabotages you automatically. These small signs are evidence of real reconfiguration. Do not underestimate subtle changes. They are the foundation of lasting transformation. The mind learns through repetition and consistency, not through isolated moments of enthusiasm. Daily coherence, even when there are no immediate visible results, is the true investment. Every time you consciously choose a more aligned thought, you strengthen a neural pathway that will facilitate similar choices in the future. Over time, effort decreases because the new pattern becomes automatic. Just as you once learned, without noticing, to react from old habits, you can also learn to respond from new states. It is not about perfection, it is about direction. Even when occasional setbacks appear, you no longer identify with them, you observe them, correct them, and continue. Identity is not defined by a single error, it is defined by the dominant tendency. When the dominant tendency is coherence, the system self-regulates. Life begins to feel less chaotic and more intelligible. You start recognizing patterns, understanding your own cycles, and anticipating your inner states with greater precision. This self-observation does not create rigidity, it creates practical wisdom. You know when you need rest, when you need focus, when you need to release control, when you need to affirm direction. Consciousness becomes a fine instrument, not a hammer. Your relationship with yourself softens. You no longer need to punish yourself in order to correct yourself. You understand that every adjustment is part of learning. This inner kindness further strengthens emotional stability, creating a virtuous circle. A mind that feels safe learns faster, integrates better, and opens more easily to new possibilities. Inner security does not depend on external guarantees. It depends on trust in your ability to self-regulate, to reorient, to sustain coherence even in uncertain scenarios. And that trust is born directly from the progressive mastery of inner dialogue. When you know you can consciously influence your inner narrative, you recover a deep sense of agency. You do not control the world, but you govern how you position yourself in relation to it. That inner positioning determines what kind of experiences you attract, what kind of people resonate with you, what kind of opportunities open. Life does not respond to sporadic wishes, it responds to stable states. That is why the real work is not accumulating techniques, it is consolidating identity. Technique serves only as an initial bridge. Identity is the permanent foundation. When your inner dialogue aligns with a broader, more conscious, more coherent identity, everything else begins to reorganize without force, not because the universe rewards you, but because you have become a new cause. And every cause generates consistent effects. Transformation is not a single event, it is a way of becoming, living continuity that renews itself in every instant of conscious attention. Each moment is an opportunity to reaffirm who you are, what you choose to sustain, what kind of mind you are cultivating. The sum of these moments builds your experience. Nothing is separate from this process. Everything is happening now, in the silent dialogue you are holding with yourself. And when you finally understand this, not as an intellectual idea, but as a living experience, something settles within you with a deep calm. You stop trying so hard to change the world and begin to focus on staying aligned. You no longer chase results as if they were something external that you lack. You start living from an inner state that naturally generates them. The mind stops fragmenting between what it desires and what it fears, between what it hopes for and what it doubts, and begins to unify around a clearer identity. That unification is silent power. It makes no noise, needs no proof, demands no recognition. It simply operates. From there, every thought gains weight. Every emotion has direction. Every decision is born with greater coherence. You become more sensitive to your own states, more attentive to small deviations, more capable of correcting yourself without drama, without guilt, without rigidity. Life stops feeling like a sequence of reactions and transforms into a conscious dance between intention and response. You discover that you do not need to control every detail to live with stability. You only need to care for the inner cause with consistency. That consistency is not tension, it is presence. It is remembering again and again who you choose to be, even when circumstances have not yet fully reflected that state. Over time, the gap between the inner and the outer shortens, not because you force anything, but because coherence becomes dominant. Identity consolidates. The mind learns to inhabit a new balance, and from that balance, experience reorganizes itself naturally. You realize that the true miracle is not that something external changes, but that you no longer depend on that change to feel aligned. The center moves inward. Stability becomes internal. Clarity stops being an occasional event and becomes a habitual quality. When the inner dialogue becomes an ally instead of a judge, life feels lighter, more fluid, more intelligent. You are no longer walking against the flow. You walk with a silent understanding of how your own system works. You know that every sustained thought is a direction, that every emotion you inhabit is an instruction, that every repeated inner image is a seed. That responsibility no longer weighs you down. It liberates you. It restores your sovereignty. It restores your coherence. It restores your ability to build from within a broader, more stable, more conscious experience. There is no rush. There is no struggle. There is living practice. There is attention. There is constant choice. There is a more honest relationship with yourself. And in that relationship, a different way of living is born, where the present stops being a place of survival and becomes a creative space where each instant turns into an opportunity to reaffirm who you are and where you are growing toward. The true path is not outside. It is in the silent art of sustaining an inner dialogue that honors your expansion, your clarity, and your coherence. When that becomes natural, life no longer needs to be pushed. It simply responds.